everyone, and welcome back to In Lay Terms. Back today with us, we have Mr. Leighton Grey. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, but you might have to rename this episode in Leighton terms. Haha. This is the level of humor that my teenagers at home are subjected to. It's called dad humor in the vernacular. So there it is.
I was going to say this is going to turn back into the dad joke hour.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, you're kind enough to comment on my sense of humor when you posted the original interview. So I feel like I have to live up to the billing.
I've set the bar pretty high with the laugh reel, the gag reel at the end. Yeah. Leighton, hopefully everybody knows who you are. We'll skip that for today. You introduced yourself last time.
Hmm.
And last time you were on, we said that we were going to talk about the Mosley decision and Coots, and I will leave it to you to weave that into your response.
Hmm.
But what I want to go over is I've noticed on Twitter the last few, let's say 3 weeks, they're trying to chip away at the concept of rights. So what started 3 weeks ago with show me where in the charter the words parental rights exist. It's kind of changed and it's gotten more aggressive now. Now it's without government there are no rights. You need deterrence to defend those rights. Ergo, there are no rights without government. Your rights come from government. So with that, I'm gonna shut off in a moment. But I would like for you to walk us from the first we start walking on two legs. Man and woman come out of the forest. They have a kid. They raise a family. Is what some people call natural rights or the absolute truth, God.
Hmm.
How did that concept of rights lead to the concept of law, and how do you reconcile that with government permissions versus God-given rights? Take it away.
Okay, I'm not going to take people back into the 16th century debate between Erasmus and Martin Luther about free will. However, if you have several hours to spend, that's a very worthwhile discussion on both sides. Where do rights come from? I think we've got to go deeper and talk about free will. What is free will? What is freedom? And if you are, even if you're sort of part of the, even if you're not a Christian, you're not a Jew, you must understand, unless you're profoundly ignorant, that all of the concept of morality and law in Western culture and Western societies and Western constitutions is biblically based. So when we go back to the book of Genesis, it's the Imago Dei. Human beings are made in the image of God, and we're given free will. And those of us who are on the, on the Christian side of things, we say that we exercise free will poorly in the garden, and so we were cast out. But what does this mean in real terms? Well, I think the real starting point for rights, and this might seem counterintuitive to people, is the Ten Commandments, which again are foundational to all of our law and all of our concepts of rights. In fact, the Ten Commandments are all the way through the Declaration of Independence in the United States. They're all the way through English common law. But essentially, when you look at the Ten Commandments, and I'm quoting Dennis Prager here, or PragerU, they're a set of rules by which humans are governed. To the extent to which we follow them, we're free. What are we set free from? Well, we're set free from sin. What is sin? Well, sin are all the terrible things that we do to ourselves and each other and society. And so what are rights? Well, rights are an expression, a translation of what that means, right, in praxis. Now, why are things now, and that sort of understanding of rights is things that are God given, that attach to us naturally, inherently, intrinsically as human beings, went on and was mostly accepted all the way through the Middle Ages. Of course, Thomas Aquinas has a very famous tract on natural law. And this concept of natural law, and that is that human laws are to express, to the extent that they are right and they are proper, and that we should follow them, must be some expression of God's law, which takes us again back to the Ten Commandments. Well, enter the Enlightenment, enter liberalism. And so through liberalism, we get a new statement of rights. And probably the most classical statement of this comes from John Stuart Mill, who famously wrote, the right of your fist ends where my nose begins. And there have been other discussions of this. And so we developed through liberalism not a positive right to do X, okay? For example, the right to life. But liberalism expresses the right to life as the right not to be killed. And there's a Danish philosopher named Hans Kelsen, a legal philosopher, who expressed these as what are called negative rights. And so what we're witnessing right now with people are saying that we don't have any natural rights, that actually we only have privileges that exist at the pleasure of the crown. This is really the end point of liberalism, which people like Nietzsche predicted when he said that God was dead. What he was really saying was that this Judeo-Christian morality, which had guided the Western civilization, going all the way back to the earliest days of the Jews leaving Egypt, was coming to an end, and that something else was going to replace it. Well, the people who are saying what you just said they have the replacement, and the replacement is liberalism. And the problem is liberalism is a secular idea which takes God out of the equation, which destroys the rule of law, first of all, because the rule of law says that we're all equal under the law, and that's fine, but it also says that no one's above the law. Well, how can you not be above the law if you are a ruler in a godless kingdom? And that's what Canada is today. Sadly, our politicians do not talk about God. They do not lead prayer services. They do not have any understanding that they are beholden to anything or anyone. Right now, as you know, our prime minister is in scandal number infinity over the Iran scam, the Arrive scam. Which was supposed to cost $80,000, has cost $54 million, and we now know, according to recent reports, that $20 million of that was directed within the Prime Minister's knowledge, and he's just bone dead silent on it. He's off hiding while two of his ministers are, believe it or not, taking bullets from the mass media. So we are in a state where liberalism, sadly, is descending into nihilism. And nihilism, what I mean by that is an absence of meaning in life. And that's the problem with liberalism. I believe that right now what we are witnessing in the West, in Canada, is a tension between people who are trying to drive us into nihilism and those who are trying to recapture and build a renaissance of what are called conservative values. And what I mean by conservative is that I'm talking about Dr. Roger Scruton's sense of this, and what I mean by conservative is that we conserve what is beautiful and worthy about the past so that we can cherish it and carry it on to future generations. So what that means in practice is that if I went into your home and I was invited into your living room, which seems unlikely, but I would accept the invitation if given the opportunity, I would see pictures of you with your friends and family. I might see mementos. I might see different things. I might see a cross. I might see some other religious symbol hanging there. I might see a cherished work of art, and all of these things would communicate to me what you hold dear, what you think is worthy of conservation. That's what conservatism is. It's not lower taxes. It's not smaller government. Those things are manifestations of conservatism, but at core, the best expression of it was Roger Scruton, who coined a term called oikophilia. Oiko means home, and philia is the Greek word for love. These are the combination of two Greek words. So when we say conservatism, what we're really saying is love of home. And coming back to the rights discussion, these rights are part of that. We have a history in Western culture of cherishing individual liberty, free choice, freedom and protection from government abuse and overreach, going all the way back to 1215 and the Magna Carta, and even further if you want to look. And all of that is being whittled away by people who want to make the state all powerful and supreme. And if you want to take that expression even further, you can look at the WHO pandemic treaty, which I just wrote a paper on for my a commentary on for my show, and say that in fact we more than just doing that within nations, we're talking about expressing that globally. Because if you look at the UN Charter in its origins back in 1946. You would see the word rights used throughout its founding documents. Well, I looked, and the word rights, believe it or not, appears but once in the new founding documents in the UN and in the WHO pandemic treaty. Even though they talk about we the people, they borrow of course, from the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence, but they talk about rights but one time. So the answer to your question is, we're in a battle. We're in a battle to preserve rights as an expression of the dignity and the sovereignty and the independence and the value of individual human beings. The Imago Dei, going right back to the beginning, the idea that we're created in the image of God, and therefore our rights are inviolable by the state. The state must protect them, and to the extent that the state refuses to do that or violates them, that state is an expression of something that is vile and evil and not to be supported. In fact, Aquinas would say that we have a duty to disobey unjust laws. And any law in Canada that violates our individual human rights is an unjust law. Now, speaking specifically about the Charter, and I'll just finish on this thought before I come back to you. There's a wonderful book that was written by an Alberta historian named Michael Wagner. It's called "Leaving God Behind." It's a brilliant book. It's brilliant in its simplicity and its clarity, and what it communicates. And it is this: Michael Wagner's thesis is that Pierre Elliott Trudeau's real purpose in bringing the Charter into Canadian law, bearing in mind that he was a communist, an avowed communist, and a member of the Club of Rome, and an atheist, was not to preserve the rights and freedoms that we always had, but to effect two purposes. Number one, to secularize Canada, because if you study the Charter, you know that one of the first things that happened after the Charter came into effect is that we got a Supreme Court of Canada decision called Big M Drug Mart that set aside and struck down the Lord's Day Act as unconstitutional. So one of the purposes of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, according to Dr. Wagner, was to secularize Canadian society. Of course, we've seen this happen throughout the last 40 years. We've had over 100 Christian churches have been burned just in the past few years, and this is going on and on. The other purpose, and we touched on this a little bit in our first conversation, was to surreptitiously transfer lawmaking power from legislatures, from elected legislatures, which express the will of the people, to unelected judges. Well, how does this relate to the rights synthesis? Well, what has happened over the course of the Charter is that judges have been making law. And how have they been making law? Well, they've been creating new rights for LGBTQ people, rights for the Indigenous, rights for women who want to have abortions, all kinds of new classes and categories of rights. And at the same time, reading down and making less significant, less sacred, the very rights that are enunciated in the Charter. And when you talk to people like Brian Peckford, he'll tell you, because he sat at the table and he actually drafted some of those sections, this was something that was very alive in the conversations between those premiers. They were very worried that the Charter would result in this very situation, that these judges would go off and exercise this Promethean power. And so now, as you rightly point out, there's people saying, well, parental rights, what are they? The courts haven't recognized that. And they're not in the Charter, but they are in the Charter. They're implicit in the Charter. They're implicit in Section 7, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. They're implicit in Section 2A, of religious expression, because that's part of parental rights. They're implicit in freedom of expression, because part of expressing yourself is the way that you choose to raise your children. So the rights, and in Section 15, equality rights. So the parental rights are all over the Charter and within the Charter. But, the people who want to destroy individual liberty and make a quote unquote a god of the state, of course, will use any opportunity. I'm talking about the leftists, the small L liberals, who really are promoting erroneously, this concept of liberalism to the nth degree, to the point of nihilism. They will stop at nothing to destroy the traditional values which underpin this country. And if we allow this to happen, I think we're really inviting disaster. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but as you can see, I've spent a lot of time meditating on this subject.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm sort of in the same boat. No wife, no life, no kids. I just walk around talking to myself. I always think about these things.
Well, we
So,
need people like you. That was a guy, and seems to me there was a guy working in a Swiss postal office, was in the same boat, and he came up with one of the most important ideas in the history of science. I don't think
well,
Newton was married while he was at Oxford either, but or was it Cambridge? I,
I'm assuming you're referencing Einstein, the patent
yeah,
thief. Yeah.
yes, of course, yes. I bet he
Um,
was a terrible employee.
oh, him? Yeah, he's stealing everyone's idea, putting his name on it. Where was I going with this? Oh, so you use the word, you use the phrase leftist, and
Yeah,
it is coming out of the left.
yeah,
And what I've noticed is that the left, they're fantastic at manipulating language, and they're running circles around us, people that love liberty. And every time we get into a debate with them or discussion, we've pretty much lost the moment we get in because we don't agree on definitions and they just twist the
hmm
meaning of words. So what I'm trying to do is kind of educate the public on core principles. So let's start with the charter. You mentioned last time that the charter is part of the beginning of the problem of judicial activism. So
yes.
the judges legislating, they're executive legislators. Is there something unique to the charter? Is there a line in there and says, by the way, addendum, judges now have the right to legislate? Like, how did we go from, I guess, what was common law, British common law, to this insanity?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm going to go back a little bit further to the common law. And what the common law did is it was more than common law is more than just a body of law. And when I say common law, what I mean is the whole history of decisions of judges that have been made over many centuries, in which they both interpret the laws that are created by legislatures and set down really important basic principles of law, which to a large degree have shaped society, but also made sense of certain trends that have happened over time. But prior to the Charter, in the common law tradition, what we had is sort of a conversation, a dialogue between the legislature and the courts. And at certain times, the courts would come up with a legal principle, which was wrong, which was imperfect, which went against the will of the people as expressed by the legislature. And when that occurred, and this has happened in Canadian history, it's happened throughout British history as well. Parliament or a provincial legislature has come in and they've simply perfected it by creating a new statute. And so this was done all the way up until the time of the charter. What the inception of the charter did is it made the courts essentially supreme, because it gave the courts under Section 52 of the Constitution the ability to strike down acts of Parliament and legislatures, to actually strike out law. Say, listen, legislature, you went through and you studied this problem for years. You came up with policy ideas and spent millions of dollars and had lobby groups come through and talk about this, and it was read 3 times and debated heavily in question period, and made it through the Senate, and the Governor General signed off on it. But we say this law is wrong. It's inconsistent with the Constitution. It violates the Charter, or it exceeds your authority. And when that is working properly, that's not necessarily a bad thing if the courts are interested in being a constitutional check on government overreach. So that's the theoretical principle behind the court's ability to strike down legislation. But in practice, that's not the way it's turned out. And so, effectively, the only way once a court goes against a particular law that's passed by a legislature, let's say the Alberta Sovereignty Act goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court strikes it down. The only recourse for Alberta would be to invoke Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, which has been used at certain times, especially by Quebec. In fact, for many years after the charter came into effect, Quebec would just routinely invoke the notwithstanding clause in everything that they passed. But the most obvious situation in Quebec has been language laws, which are clearly violate the Canadian Constitution. But Quebec has passed them anyway, and they've invoked the notwithstanding clause and said, "Listen, we're not going to listen to you, Supreme Court. We're not going to listen to you, federal Parliament. We're not going to follow this aspect of the Constitution." But that's sort of the short and skinny on how courts got this power. The other thing that's gone wrong in our country in terms of the courts, and you and I touched on this a little bit during our last conversation, is that for some reason, which I don't quite understand, the Supreme Court especially has gotten the view that Canadian law began in 1982, and that everything in Canadian law now must be viewed or reviewed or reconfigured, reinterpreted through the lens of the Charter. But in fact, we have centuries, or just a rich tapestry, treasure trove of law in the common law that we inherited from England, which was specifically preserved in the Constitution, but that the Supreme Court refuses to look at. I'll give you a concrete example. As everyone knows, in Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic, churches were shut down. They were told that we could not have in-person worship. Some were shut down entirely, or there were severe restrictions on attending church in person. I was one of the lawyers who went to court on behalf of churches to try and have this overturned. And of course, in Manitoba and British Columbia and in different places, these challengers were dismissed because of Section 1 of the Charter, where the court basically said, look, we have this overarching pandemic, and that essentially trumps the protected right to freedom of religion expression in the Charter. Well, in Scotland, where there is no charter, the Scottish people have the same common law rights that Canadians had pre-charter, in which Canadians constitutionally, small c constitutionally, still have. The same legal challenge was brought to Scotland, and the churches were left open. So arguably, we were more free pre-charter than we are now. And the difference is because of the way that judges are interpreting the Charter and the way that they're applying it to read down the rights that exist, actually are enunciated in the Charter, the numbered rights, and spending most of their time creating new ones that most Canadians never voted on, that we have no say in, that we're just required to respect because the courts tell us to.
So I guess my follow-up question would be, is this, I'm guessing the answer is both, but is this a case of the Charter came in and corrupted these incorruptible judges, or is this a case of corrupt judges that finally got the excuse they wanted to change law?
Yeah. I wouldn't use going corrupt, the word corrupt, I wouldn't go that far. I don't think that, I mean, let's face it, we have corrupt people in every walk of life, and there may be corrupt judges. I've spent a lifetime in the courts, so there's not a single judge I've ever been in front of that I would describe as corrupt. But are judges ideological? Do they have ideological biases that are expressed in their judgments? Absolutely. And this seems to get worse as you go up the ladder and you get into the appellate and the Supreme Courts. So the problem is that part of the problem is that in our country, judges are not chosen by the people. they are selected essentially. All of our Superior Court judges are selected by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister appoints just about everybody in this country, from diplomats to judges to cabinet ministers, on and on and on and on. CEOs of crown corporations, all of it has to run through the Prime Minister's office. This is one of the vestiges of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and it's a trend that has continued. In fact, even Stephen Harper was guilty of it. I hate to say it, but it's true, of concentrating power in the Prime Minister's office. And this has led to judges being selected on an ideological basis, and they take those values up to the bench with them when they put on the fancy robes. They don't go away. And as I mentioned, I think the last time I was on your program, there was a recent National Post series of articles that showed that 80% of the Superior Court judges that have been selected during the Trudeau era are Liberal Party donors. And if you go back over the last 30 years, we've had mostly Liberal governance, going from Jean Chrétien to Paul Martin, and then Justin Trudeau. They've had the conch in Canada most of the time, and so they've been selecting the era of judges that we have sitting in this court right now is largely not only small L Liberal, which is generally true of lawyers and judges, unfortunately, but also large L Liberal, and they take with them, unfortunately, a lot of their political views. The most obvious expression of this recently is at the Chief Justice level of our Supreme Court. As you probably know, Chief Justice Wagner came out publicly during the Freedom Convoy in an interview in Les Devoirs. And of course, it seems like people always say the worst things in French. But the translation essentially was that the Freedom Convoy protesters were usurpers, that they were essentially engaged in acts of terror against the state, and that and then of course they were completely vindicated subsequently by a federal court judge. But then you super add on to that the comments of our former Chief Judge, Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who is the longest serving Chief Judge of our court in history, who's now strangely serving on a human rights tribunal in China. But she came out and she authored 2 op-eds in which she not only backed up what Chief Justice Wagner said, but went further and has said that essentially Section 1 of the Charter is the only effective section of the Charter, and that governments are always justified in limiting rights, whether it comes down to masking or social distancing or any of these things. That it is the government's role and the government's right to limit the enunciated rights in the Charter. Essentially, she says that they are privileges which exist at the pleasure, at the indulgence of the Crown. And so this is rather worrisome, but explains a lot of why rights in the Canadian context have been cheapened in recent years.
Ties nicely with what I wanted to talk about next, which is the Mosley decision.
Right.
So I'm going to give two countering positions. So one is from popular culture, Law and Order, the television show. Some defendants harmed a bunch of kids, and then the judge is like, unfortunately, the state only allows me to sentence you to a maximum of life imprisonment, something like that. And he just he spanks the guy down. Something similar happened in England maybe a decade ago, where these hoodlum youth kids kicked this boy to death in front of his girlfriend.
All the case, yeah.
And the judge said, at least with animals they kill for a purpose, for food, but you guys are even worse than that. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, to citizens, the judge they just love dressing people down. But with the Mosley decision, and I read the whole thing, I just came to the conclusion, first of all, Mosley was like, you had this massive protest of basically, evil people, and you had these insanely evil terrorists, which is what that's the impression I got with the way they characterized Coots for. Mm-hmm. And then he goes, oh, by the way, he lifts the government's hand, he gives him a little slap on the wrist. He's like, no, you used the wrong tool. This is how you can fix it. So tweak it next time you can use it.
Yeah.
But I understand courts are supposed to be impartial, but that doesn't seem impartial to me. Tell me if I'm wrong, if or what's going on.
Well, there's different schools of thought on this. When I look at the Mosley decision and I've read it, what I see, first of all, is it's going to be very difficult to overturn it on appeal. It's a very well-reasoned decision. This is a very experienced judge, 74 years old. He's been on the bench a long time. And he obviously deliberated very, very carefully. And there are things that experienced judges can do to insulate their judgments from appeal. And based on my reading of this, he has crossed all the I's and dotted all the T's, as it were. And so what he's done is he has set up a scenario in which if this case is going to be overturned, it's going to be overturned on the basis of an expression of political ideology by an appellate court. Now, that's certainly conceivable. It could happen. But if it does happen, it's going to be transparently obvious to the Canadian public and certainly to all the lawyers and judges in the country. And it will signal really a very, very dangerous situation in Canada, which some people say exists and which others don't yet believe. I don't yet believe that our courts are corrupt. I don't yet believe that our courts are fully politicized. I'm not that. There's too much happening. Every time I think that, we get a bolt of lightning out of the sky, like what Mosley did, or what happened in our case in Ingram, which Viva Fry on his podcast is calling the most important decision in Alberta history. But coming back to your question, is this a situation where the judge is actually telling the legislature how to fix what they did wrong, and are they supposed to be doing that? My answer would be yes, because again, coming back to my what I explained a few minutes ago about the historical dialogue between courts and the legislature, I think actually a court is properly doing its duty when it explains to the legislature why a law that it has passed or the way that it has applied a law and put it into effect has exceeded their statutory authority. That's useful information. And the way this conversation is supposed to go is the court's supposed to tell the legislature what they did wrong, tell them how they can fix it, so that then they have the ability to go back and create a law which is more consistent with the Constitution. And so giving Justice Mosley the benefit of the doubt, he's properly exercising the judicial function there. However, I do respect and I realize how some people could read that and say, hey, well, this isn't really fair. It's like, a referee in a hockey game, calling a penalty and then, telling the guy on the way to the penalty box, that next time you use your stick this way, and if I see you do it, I won't call a penalty, as opposed to saying, hey, you don't do that. If you do that, I'm going to call it a penalty. I'm going to send you to the box. So I mean, there's different ways that a fan could sort of view that. If you're a hockey fan, for example, something that just happened recently was this Ottawa Senators player coming down and taking a slap shot into an empty net. Of course, the Toronto player goes over and just hammers him, and because it involved the Toronto Maple Leafs, of course, all of social media was up in arms. But you saw sort of a divided. It was interesting microcosm of Canadian culture, seeing how people reacted differently to this, and I've sort of draw an analogy, to that and the situation with Justice Mosley. I mean, anytime something happens, we're going to interpret it in ways that are consistent with our own Weltanschauung, the way we see the world. So it is conceivable some people would view Justice Mosley's decision in that way, but I don't. I think the way I read it is he was quite properly exercising the judicial function. And I'm not just saying that because I like the end result. I'm saying that because I think this is what judges are intended to do under our Constitution, is to interpret the law and to apply it in a way that's consistent with the Constitution, and then to go further and make it clear to the legislature why that finding was made. Because otherwise, how can the legislature correct its own practice. I'm not saying that the Liberal government has shown a propensity to correct its mistakes. It's very good at committing mistakes, but it hasn't. It's found itself, in my opinion, to be rather incorrigible. So I don't expect that they're going to go back and make effective changes to the Emergencies Act, which is exactly what Chrystia Freeland indicated. She came out within 30 minutes and said, "Well, we're not going to respect what the judge said. We can't learn anything from this learned judge because we're smarter than them. We are all powerful. We are the state, and we're simply going to tell this judge that he's wrong."
Yeah, I love the part where she had no life left in her eyes when she gave that announcement. She was so like a deflated balloon.
Oh yeah, just amazing.
I kind of want to end where we started. So just going back to the concept of where laws come from, where rights come from. When you're creating a business, let's say you want to start a restaurant, like you can just make things up on the fly. Like you're going to have a vegan restaurant and the color theme and the furniture. But when you're making laws, like in a state, you like the founders, they didn't just say, "Oh, freedom of speech, that sounds cool. I'll drink to that," and put that in there. Like it's based on observations in reality, right? Am I? Feel free to disagree with me if I'm wrong, but it goes from like rights to law, correct or incorrect?
Yes, I think that's so. And I mean, let's take speech for a moment. Speech is the foundational right because it's the one that you can use to win back all the other rights. And also, if you are someone who understands the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's important to understand how the universe was created. We had an all-powerful, omniscient God that spoke the universe into existence. Okay, that's significant. And all of our rights, how this extends to us, is that all of our rights have to be walked out. They have to be expressed. The Soviet Union had a beautiful constitution, lovely Bill of Rights, but no one in that state was free. No one under that empire was free because the people did not walk them out. They could not. They were suppressed, and they were oppressed, and they were punished by the state if they did. And this is why, in when we're talking about rights, we must exercise them. If we don't exercise them, if we don't speak them out, then we will lose them. That's what we're learning that's what the COVID era should teach us. And sometimes we'll go to court or we'll lose. Sometimes we'll speak these out in the public square and we'll get shouted down. And so, sometimes we'll be in our homes. We'll have an argument at the dinner table and we'll disagree about such things. And someone will leave and perhaps they won't talk to us for a while. But we still must express the truth and we have to speak them out because these rights are versions of our expressions of what is true and what is real. And I happen to think that is what is really going on right now in our society. Is we're on a battleground. The battleground is, what is truth? What is reality? And how do we express that? Well, we express it in words. And what you said earlier was so true. The other side will manipulate words. They changed the definition of a pandemic. They changed the definition of a vaccine. They changed the definition of an emergency. But we know what the truth is. We know what rights are. We know that they're not privileges. We know there's a distinction there. We understand these things clearly and innately. The question is, are we willing to speak these out and to walk them out so that our actions are aligned with our words? That's where things are breaking down in the West, I find. Not enough people are willing to walk out their rights. They're willing to post about them and complain about them on social media. But are they willing to actually get up and get out there and actually, let's say, engage in a peaceful protest in Ottawa in February of 2022? That's the penultimate example of what I'm talking about. Lots of us sympathize with the Freedom Convoy, but the people who went there, God bless them, they actually walked out those rights. They meant it.
Mr. Gray, I guess we can end on a very simple question. Can you tell me what is the word God? What does that mean to you?
My God is a loving Father. That's what He is. He's the loving Father. God is the source of everything that is true and beautiful and real and unconditionally loving in the universe. Everything that is good in our world comes from that source. So God is the guiding light of my life. And coming back to words, His words, His truth have been revealed to us, and it's in a book called the Bible. So anybody who hasn't read it, it's a great place to start. If you want to discover God, it's right there on page 1. And in every single page that follows is the story of God that leads inexorably to His Son, Jesus Christ, who is our Savior and has redeemed us all. And He's won the ultimate battle. And everything that we're doing on this earth, really, in the end, doesn't matter because of John 3:16.
Oh, what is it for is that the quote you just?
For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in Him shall not perish, but shall have eternal life. And everything else it's playing out, I think, and I agree with Tucker Carlson about this. I think I mentioned this on your show previously. He got fired from Fox for saying this. Is not political. It's not right versus left. It's not conservative, versus liberal. It's not, Christian versus atheist. It's not all these divisions. Ultimately, what we're living through right now is an eternal struggle of good versus evil. And, which we know, those of us on our side of the debate, we know we've already won. But we still have to walk out the battle. We still have to live out the battle. And we have to speak up, for truth. I think that when people begin to understand that, they'll be less afraid. They'll be less anxious. They'll be more trusting. And they'll feel more free. And they'll understand that actually they do have rights, no matter what their government or what social media or the mass media or anybody else tells them. That they do have rights, and their rights are God-given, God-ordained, and most importantly, there's a God in heaven that loves them unconditionally. How beautiful is that?
I think one of the benefits, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is it snapped people out of this belief in atheism, because it was it seemed like cooler. We have government, we have laws, we have courts, we have smartphones, we don't need God. And then Trudeau government comes along like, oh no, we do need God. So it's,
it's talk about atheism. I get into it sometimes with people about atheism. They think I'm too hard on atheists, and if I am, I don't mean to be. It's just that even though some very incredibly brilliant minds like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and others argue so fervently in favor of atheism. Atheism fundamentally it always devolves into a belief system, and so therefore it becomes incoherent, because essentially atheists argue that theism, belief in God, is unsustainable, that everything has to be based upon facts and on science. But once you get into a debate with an atheist, and if people want to see what I mean, they should watch some of the debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, for example. And ultimately, what atheism is revealed to be is a belief system. Everything is a belief system. The diversity, inclusion, equity. That's a religion. That's a secular religion, which is, in my respectful view, closely aligned with the satanic cult, which is not worshiping some big red guy with a pointy tail and horns, but is actually the worship of self. I mean, that's what and people who are Satanists, they'll say this: well, we don't worship the devil. We exalt the self. This goes back to the book, to Genesis, where the serpent says, eat of this fruit, ye shall be as gods. That's where it begins. Those of us who believe in God or and this higher power, what we're really doing is we're saying, well, we're not the most important being in the universe. Actually, we're part of a natural hierarchy. And not that human beings are not important, but actually the importance of the human being, ironically, becomes exalted under the aegis of a Judeo-Christian culture. So that and again, it comes back to this Imago Dei, because we believe that human life is sacred, we protect it through rights. And in fact, it's atheistic societies. I'm not throwing rocks at atheists here, but it's atheistic societies which have been the great mass murderers of history. Just look at the 20th century alone. Over 100 million people murdered in atheistic societies like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and Cuba and Maoist China and others. And that's not even counting the famines, which coincidentally just happen to occur most often in atheistic communist states.
Well, it's purely a coincidence. It has to be. Yeah.
Just read the Black Book of Communism. It's all there.
Well, Mr. Gray, unfortunately, we couldn't keep the show in lay terms, but it was still interesting. But I'm sure the audience, they learned a lot, and hopefully they'll be armed with some tools to push back against this, I don't know, government creep.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know if there's any other solution, if there's any other way to do it than what I've said. However, if people disagree with me, that's great. I love living in a society where we can disagree with each other, and we can do it civilly. And I respect other people's beliefs. But it's funny. The Christians, as Tucker Carlson said, we're the only ones who are commanded to pray for our enemies. Just to leave off, Sean Buckley, who's a friend of mine, he's a lawyer who sort of spearheaded the National Citizens Inquiry. He gave a great talk about the Lord's second commandment, which is love thy neighbor. And he said something really struck me. I'll just leave off on this note. What kind of a society would we live in if we actually just lived out that one truth, love thy neighbor? I mean, we probably wouldn't need laws. We wouldn't need police. We wouldn't need guns. I'll just leave people with to meditate on that one thought about why people like me happen to be Christians. It's because we seek to live in a world, in a society where we do love our neighbors, and in a society where we would love our neighbors, we would have no need of rights.
Well, Mr. Gray, thank you very much for your time and for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been my distinct pleasure. Best of luck to you and continued success with your program.
Thank you. Bye.